Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs, and as you can see, I'm not in the Joe Blog studio today. I'm actually here in Spain. You can see I've got cactus, swimming pool behind me. You may be able to hear the sound of running water. And in today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, because it's just been announced by Bloomberg that 3 of the systemically important Russian banks have been talking to the Russian central bank about a potential bailout at some point in the next 12 months. And the reason why these banks are talking about a bailout is because the level of bad debts in Russia is rising rapidly. So if you know how banking system works, basically there's a lot of leverage in banking. So the banks take money in from people who want to deposit cash with them. So that's how they build up their capital initially. And then they lend that money out to companies and individuals that want to borrow it. But the problem is that they don't just do a simple one-for-one transaction. Generally speaking, it will be more like a 10-to-1 transaction, or possibly even 20-to-1. So for every dollar that they're holding in capital, they might be lending $10 or $20. Now that all works fine when everybody repays the interest and makes all of their repayments. But the problem that you have is that when people start to default on their loans, so if corporates and individuals say we can't afford to pay the interest, we can't afford to pay back the debt, then you need to have a solid capital base to be able to absorb those losses. Now losses in Russia as of April this year were running at around 4%. That was what the average bad debt was on Russian bank books. However, VTB, the second largest lender in Russia, recently announced that its bad debts, its non-performing loans, have increased to 5%, which represents a 1.2% increase since the start of 2025. And they're now forecasting that the bad debts by the end of this year might be up to 7 or 8%. Now that's obviously their estimate, but if things continue to get worse in the Russian economy, then things will start to deteriorate more rapidly. And in terms of consumers, it was recently reported that 10.5% of all consumer debt is now in arrears more than 90 days. So that basically means that those people haven't been making interest payments for the last 3 months. So they've missed 3 repayments or 3 interest payments. And that's then officially declared as a non-performing loan. So what we are seeing is the level of bad debts is getting progressively worse in Russian banks. And the reason why these 3 large Russian lenders have sought the assistance from the Russian central bank is because they're forecasting that their balance sheets won't be able to accommodate all of these losses. So this is very similar to what happened in the rest of the world in 2008. I'll give you a quick history lesson if you're not familiar with the global financial crisis. But basically, we had lots and lots of really high-risk debt that was built up. Firstly, in the USA, we had these things called collateralized debt obligations, collateralized loan obligations, where basically institutions were leveraging up. They were borrowing more and more and more money, and they didn't really have the capital to be able to repay it. And as those debts started to sour, as they went wrong, then the banks basically didn't have enough capital to absorb that, and a lot of them became insolvent, and we had to see central banks and governments all around the world stepping in and bailing out those banks. And that happened in many, many countries. And some countries are still trying to sort out the problems with those banks today. And that's 17 years later. But what we've got in Russia isn't a global systemic thing. It's not something that's going to happen as a result of every bank in the world suddenly going into a big situation where they haven't got enough capital. This is basically just focused on what's happening in Russia itself. And the reason why the corporates are unable to repay their debt is because interest rates are currently running at 20% in Russia. Now that's an incredibly high amount. If you're borrowing $100, you're having to pay back $20 every single year in interest, and that's before the $100. So if you had that debt for 5 years, then you would basically be paying back $100 in interest for a $100 loan. So that is incredibly expensive. And Russian corporates and individuals have been taking on more debt over the past 3 years Since the war in Ukraine started, we've seen Russia converting itself to the wartime economy. We've spoken about this a lot on the channel, whereby lots of corporates are now being sponsored directly by the Kremlin. They're being paid to keep the war in Ukraine going, to supply all of the equipment and all of everything that Russia needs. And so those companies are fine. They're not having to take on more debt because they're being paid directly by the Kremlin. But what's happened as a result of that is that we've seen wages rising rapidly all across Russia because those sponsored companies are offering higher wages to attract in more staff so that they can maximize their output and receive lots of payments directly from the state. But that's pushed up wages across the board. That's made things more expensive for the other companies. And so they've had to take on debt to keep their payments going. And if you follow the channel, you know, recently posted a video talking about the fact that producer prices in Russia are not growing at all at the moment. So the latest data that we've seen is that year-on-year producer prices, also known as factory gate prices, so the price of products once they're leaving Russian factories, increased by 0.1% in the last 12 months. And that compares to inflation of around 9.4%. So overall prices are rising rapidly, but Russian companies are not able to increase their prices because the price rises that Russia is seeing is coming mostly from imports as a result of the sanctions and the problems that Russia is having trying to source enough overseas goods and services to come into Russia. So the Russian companies have had to take on more debt because they've seen their profit margins being squeezed. They're making less profit in a very competitive market, and so they're taking on more debt. That's causing them to pay more interest, putting more pressure onto their balance sheets. So lots of companies are now at the point where they can't continue to afford to pay 20% interest plus the repayments. And so they're on the verge of defaulting on their debt, and the Russian banks can see this happening. This is a car crash that's happening in slow motion for these Russian banks. So they're aware that the bad debt situation is getting worse. That's why they've told the central bank that it's likely that in the next 12 months that they're going to need some form of capital injection. And what that will mean is that the Russian state will have to inject probably hundreds of billions of dollars into the financial system to make sure that all of these financial lenders remain solvent. But the problem with that is that the Russian state needs to find that money from somewhere. And the place that it will find it is the National Wealth Fund. And if you've been following the channel, you'll be aware that the National Wealth Fund has been drained over the last 12 months as a result of the fact that Russia has been using it to fund the war in Ukraine. At the start of the war, it was around $150 billion of liquid assets. It's now down to around $35 billion. And if Russia has to use some of that money to bail out the financial institutions, then that's going to represent a serious problem, and it will mean the National Wealth Fund will deplete more rapidly. That means there will be less money to fund the war in Ukraine, and there will come a point where Russia basically runs out of capital. And this financial strain that's now being caused by the bad debt situation in Russia is accelerating the problems. Now, the report that was published in Bloomberg says that the three of the biggest lenders have gone to the state. But actually, it's likely that the smaller lenders will also be in financial difficulty. It's just that they haven't gone to the central bank yet and said, we're going to need a bailout. Because what we saw back in 2008 when the global financial crisis struck was that it started with a couple of relatively inconsequential banks. So we had Bear Stearns in the USA that most people had never even heard of. They went into financial difficulty, they were bailed out. And then Lehman Brothers, that was an investment bank that most people thought was golden, it was in one of these places like Goldman Sachs that was untouchable. It needed a bailout, and the US government actually turned around and said, we're not going to bail you out, and allowed Lehman Brothers to fail. And that started a domino effect where we then saw hundreds and hundreds of financial institutions becoming illiquid in the USA and all around the world. And it's likely that the same will happen in Russia. If we see one bank needing a bailout, it won't be an isolated case. It's likely that hundreds of financial institutions will then also need a bailout. And the big question is whether or not Russia will be able to afford to pay for all of those companies, those financial institutions to be bailed out. So the overall summary of today's video is that it's been reported that 3 of Russia's biggest lenders have gone to the central bank and said, we may need a bailout at some point in the next 12 months. And that's because bad debts are rising in Russia. Companies and individuals can't afford to pay back the debt that they've taken on over the past few years. Interest rates are now sitting at 20%, making that debt very expensive. And it's likely that we will start to see more corporate failures, more individual bankruptcies, and that's going to put pressure on the financial institutions, and those banks could become insolvent over the next 12 to 18 months. That will then put pressure on the Russian government to bail them out, and if it does, the big question is, where is Russia going to get all of this capital from? So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you've enjoyed seeing me in a slightly more relaxed environment. Look, I'm leaning back, but it is very hot here. As you can see, you don't grow cactus trees in places where it isn't very warm. But I'm having a nice holiday, I'm having a break, but I wanted to post this video because I saw the story and I thought it was something that you'd be interested in. I wanted to share it with you because it's just another step on the road that Russia is making at the moment, and I know a lot of people are interested in what's happening in the Russian economy, but it hasn't taken too much time out of my day. Don't worry about it, I'm still having a nice break. I might post a few more videos. You might see this scenery, you might see some other scenery. I might decide to go and do some videoing somewhere else, but hopefully you've enjoyed joining me over here in Spain. It's lovely and sunny. It's early evening now, but it's still really hot. So I will be going out for dinner shortly, but hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode. If you did, then please give me a thumbs up. Thanks to everyone that's supporting me. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a Patreon or a member or a Buy Me a Coffee member, then thank you so much for that support. And I don't know whether I'll be able to put a smile on your face. I'll see if I can when I'm doing the editing in this. Hopefully I can, and let's see if I can now.